What's up, guys? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So, Chapter 5 in the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology. This one is going to be on hormonal mechanisms of partnership formation. So, this is the chapter here, the next slide that we're looking at here, called Hormonal Mechanisms of Partnership Formation. As I said, Chapter 5 in the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and Romantic Relationships. So, going forward here to the next slide, what do we know here? What should we start with? Hormones, they have a big role in mate selection, right? And partnership formation, long-term formation, sexual behavior, all of that sort of a thing. So, testosterone broadly has a role in desire, libido, mate seeking, also in intersexual competition, right? So, contest competitions. One form of indirect mate selection, right? Intersexual competition there. Estrogen as well regulates cyclic processes, particularly for women, right? The menstrual cycle. And this can also kind of regulate mate preferences as well as individual behavior in women, both their kind of active behavior as far as seeking mates as well as receptive behavior. How do they respond to approaches, that sort of a thing, right? So we know that biological processes that drive mating motivations, behavior, that sort of a thing, they're impacted by these gonadal hormones, right? And these hormones regulate that behavior. So how you will respond to a certain stimulus. And usually these hormones are simply upregulating, right? So the more mating relevant hormones that you have floating around at a given time, the more mating behavior. Not all of them, as we'll come to see. For example, high progesterone can kind of suppress libido, sexual behavior in women in some cases across the cycle. But some examples of that, higher estradiol in women, for example, higher ratings of male pictures. So when this sex hormone is higher in women, they tend to give higher ratings to male faces, right? Higher testosterone in men, it can result in more male-male competition. You can put men in all kinds of different competitive circumstances. If they have higher testosterone, they're more likely to engage in competitive behavior with one another. And engaging in competitive behavior also boosts testosterone acutely, right? Small effects, but they're there. And we know across all sorts of animal studies and some studies in human beings, if you disrupt these hormones, then you will start to see impairments on sexual mating function, right? So in rats, for example, you disrupt these hormones, they can even have trouble distinguishing between like another male or a female rat. It can get quite pronounced in some animal models, when you do full castration, that sort of a thing. So let's go on now to the next slide. Some hormones and mating behavior, right? The role of testosterone often kind of stands out as kind of the primary mating hormone or sex hormone related specifically to sexual or mating behavior, right? But they're all kind of important in that sense. So we know that testosterone can regulate both consummatory and appetitive behavior. So consummatory, the mechanics, right, of sexual behavior, being able to get an erection in animals like mounting behavior. Are they approaching the female animal? Are they trying to mount them? Are they engaging in this kind of behavior? Are they even able to do it? Are they able to ejaculate? Those sorts of things regulated by testosterone. Then appetite, right? So also libido, sex drive. Does someone want to seek out a mate, right? Do they feel attraction toward a member of the opposite sex or the same sex or whatever the case may be? And also, how willing are they to compete for a mate in a given kind of competition situation, right? So kind of these two things that testosterone can regulate, sexual function and then also kind of sexual drive in the same sense, right? So aggression and competition, very important in some species, right? And winning dominance contests helps kind of provide or, secure access to mates for a lot of species. So in this sense, testosterone also facilitates kind of an indirect effect, right? So animals with more testosterone, they go on to win these competitions, then they can kind of monopolize all of the females in a group. Gorillas are a good example of that, right? Where juvenile gorillas look a certain way. When they become a dominant gorilla, right, they kind of become a silverback gorilla. They get that surge of testosterone that causes an increase in size, an increase in the silver coloration that they get their name for, and then they begin to monopolize kind of a harem of female gorillas in that sense. Another animal, that I talk about sometimes, sugar glider, right? The dominant male sugar glider collects a bunch of, look these guys up, they're cute looking. Collects a bunch of female sugar gliders. His testosterone surges to about twice as much as it would be for other males kind of in that group. If you take him out of that group, you transplant him into a foreign colony of sugar gliders, his testosterone just goes down. He no longer is the dominant sugar glider. So these competitions related to testosterone, kind of these dominance competitions, are very, very important as far as which animals are going to mate, much more so in non-human animals, many animal species, than human beings. But in human beings, they're probably still there, right? In our ancestral history, we don't know, that much about it, but it's possible testosterone had a much larger role then than it does now. So let's go on now to the next slide. Testosterone, human male mating. What do we know about this? So there's actually a tenuous link, okay, between testosterone and consummatory behavior. What does this mean? Male sexual function seems to function pretty well across the whole range of testosterone, right? So a guy that has very high testosterone or low testosterone, usually his sexual function is going to be pretty similar unless he's hypogonadal, right? Unless he's at the very low, like clinically low range. Then you start to see some impairments, right? But say a guy has 400 nanograms per deciliter of testosterone, another guy has 900, you typically will not see a lot of differences between groups in this sense of, like low normal to high normal testosterone. It doesn't seem to change a lot. And that's pretty true for testosterone across many interactions with personality and human behavior. I wrote an article on the website, check it out, the testosterone black pill. I go into a bunch of research on that. But yeah, so there's only a tenuous link between testosterone and consummatory behaviors in human beings. It seems to be that, you get kind of a minimum level of testosterone. Okay, great. Your sexual function seems to work okay. So there can be kind of lower sexual drive. You'll still tend to see in men that have like clinically low testosterone, they can achieve normal erections as well. Testosterone supplementation, of course, it can benefit men who are low in testosterone, right? But little effect at men who are already at normal levels. So, you might see different things like anecdotes out there as far as men that get on it. But typically across the research, if someone is already beginning with normal levels of testosterone and you give him testosterone supplementation, you don't see a lot of changes there as far as sexual behavior goes. So we know there's some research on castration, mostly of sexual offenders, and usually this is chemical castration, right? It's not actually removing the testicles of these men, but they give them some kind of drug that produces hypogonadism, chemical castration. They can no longer produce testosterone, typically infertile as well. So when this happens to men, there's actually a lot of heterogeneity in the responses, okay? Some of these men can just lose sexual desire and function like immediately. For some, it takes years, and for some, it never does. So there's a lot of individual variation, and I think this is a relationship you will see with a lot of these hormonal effects as we go across this video. There's probably very high individual variation, which is probably why so many of these results don't replicate well, or they produce different results across individuals, and there's anecdotes that say one thing and then another, because it's just very likely that these hormones have a lot of interaction effects that we don't know about, but we'll talk about that in a little bit, okay? So higher baseline sexual interest, also unrelated to natural testosterone levels. So again, say a man has, testosterone within the normal range, it's at 500 nanograms per deciliter, whatever the case may be. Another man has 900, he's not necessarily going to have higher sexual desire or sexual interest, right? That's an individual difference kind of measurement there. Some people just have much higher sexual interest and desire than others do, not closely related, if at all, to levels of testosterone. But these men that do have very high levels of sexual desire, if something happens to them that makes them hypogonadal, if they go from like normal testosterone to very low testosterone, they're the ones that are actually impacted the hardest, right? They're the ones that say, whoa, this has really, really hit my sexual functioning. The guys who don't begin with a really high baseline of sexual interest or desire, they're just not hit as hard. They're like, okay, it's basically the same, right? So there's kind of mixed results as far as testosterone and sexual behavior as far as couples go. Is it higher or lower for couples that have more sex, for example? Like I said, mixed results. We don't know. Some studies say, oh, it's higher for couples that are having frequent sex. Others say testosterone is lower for couples that are having frequent sex. So we don't know. But probably more consistent across the research is that testosterone in men is associated with mate-seeking behavior, right? So having a normal level of testosterone or higher testosterone is associated with going out and seeking mates. So groups that we know that tend to have higher testosterone, single men tend to have higher testosterone than married men. So men who get into a relationship, it's associated with a little bit of a drop in testosterone. The same is true for men that become fathers, a little bit lower of a drop. So probably testosterone, the idea here, right? What's an evolved purpose for this? Perhaps to motivate, facilitate mate-seeking behavior. You're single. Oh, you better get your testosterone up to go and seek mates or potentially to attract mates or whatever the case may be. We also see this effect in men who are in relationships but who are more open to cheating or having affairs, who show more extra-pair interest. They also have testosterone a little bit higher, kind of like a single male does, right? So it's kind of like, okay, they're in the relationship, but the relationship did not have the effect of dropping their testosterone, right? they still kind of have the hormonal profile of a single man. So that's kind of what we see with testosterone. It is kind of a motivation for mate-seeking behavior, and it's kind of conditional or environmental, right? That the same man, when he's single, he goes into a relationship and all of a sudden his testosterone drops a little bit, okay? So this is not something probably you should concern yourself with too much, because again, these are kind of small effects, and they still tend to remain, these men, like within the natural level. And kind of, as I describe in that article, as they describe kind of throughout this chapter, if you look into these papers, these aren't necessarily meaningful effects. If you look at effect sizes, like what's it going to produce? If a man goes down from 500 to 450, like, is that a big deal? Is that a meaningful effect? It's something's going on to produce it, right? But is that going to have consequences for him? In many cases, maybe not. So, that's why it's important to look at effect sizes, the natural effect size, like what does it mean to go from 500 to 450 and that kind of a thing. Anyway, next slide. So, one thing that's kind of consistent, testosterone linked with mate seeking. Now, if testosterone is linked with mate seeking behavior in men, we might also expect it to be linked with mating success in men. And that is what we see, that men who have higher testosterone on average tend to have better mating success. One mediating factor for that can be behavioral dominance, okay? So we see there's a small relationship with testosterone and behavioral dominance, but behavioral dominance is one of the best predictors of mating success for men, kind of above and beyond almost anything else. Above and beyond physical attractiveness. You can see my meta-analysis on physical attractiveness for that, where I compare it with some of this research on behavioral dominance. But it's basically like, okay, men who are socially dominant, who go out and they're motivated to seek mates, to try and have sex, to try and accumulate sexual partners, they do, right? They're the ones that end up having a lot of sexual partners. So that can be kind of a mediator there, right? Higher testosterone, higher behavioral dominance, and thus better mating success. This also facilitates men getting into relationships. So it's not just like short-term mating or whatever the case may be, accumulating a bunch of short-term partners. One of the studies they describe in here, longitudinal study. So, you look at men, time 1, time 2, et cetera, et cetera. Men that had higher testosterone at time 1 were more likely to be in committed relationships at time 2. So we know that testosterone facilitates men going out, seeking a committed mate, finding a long-term relationship, and staying in it, right? It's not just like that. We know higher testosterone is associated with a higher number of self-reported sexual partners, okay? Higher testosterone in hunter-gatherer populations as well. I think they talk about the Hadza, perhaps a couple of others in there. There was another from Suriname that they mentioned. So if you look at associations between testosterone and behaviors in these groups like hunting that confer status, higher testosterone is also associated with higher status behaviors, right? So a man who's good at hunting, so he's more desirable to mates within that culture. He also has higher testosterone, okay? So we also know in men that there's an acute effect of mating on testosterone. So we can make testosterone spike in men under certain conditions, okay? This is when mating is salient, right? So what's a really good example of that? Watching pornography, okay? Watching an erotic movie. Men do this. Oh, yeah, the testosterone goes up a little bit. Interacting with women, but again, only interacting with women in some contexts. So one of the studies they describe, I think they're interacting with a woman who's kind of a confederate of the study, like, oh, they could have a date with her, and another's just like a social. So when the men think that they're interacting with a woman who's in a potential mating context, testosterone goes up. When it's just interacting with a friend or something, not necessarily. So there's kind of knowledge there, like, okay, this is potentially a mate, and that's kind of when it spikes, okay? Why might that be? Well, it's linked with mate seeking, right? It's linked with maybe a little bit more risk taking. So, that can be kind of that extra move, that a man needs, that extra momentum or push to make a move, so to speak. Also, as I mentioned, intersexual competition. So we see this across all kinds of different games. For men, if it's like wrestling, like something physical, or something completely non-physical like chess, when men compete with other men, their serum testosterone goes up, okay? And an interesting point, one of the studies they mentioned here, this effect was even higher when the audience was female. They used some kind of ultimate frisbee experiment for one with a female audience versus a male audience. When the audience was female, the testosterone spiked even more. I think they mentioned another that was skateboarding, and when they had women record them skateboarding, so it's not actually a competition in this case, it's just men kind of doing a solo sport, skateboarding, right? When they had women recording them skateboarding, their testosterone was higher than when they had men recording them skateboarding. So kind of performance for women in that case as well can be associated with this spike. Anyway, next slide. Testosterone and interactions with ovulation. So This kind of relies on this research, the ability to detect ovulation in women, right? And they mentioned a few studies here. So one kind of example of this, one study they mentioned is like testosterone in men increases when they're exposed to women who are ovulating. So they can, bring in basically pictures of women who are ovulating and pictures not, and, expose them to these pictures and then measure the men and be like, oh, does the testosterone increase or something like that. Another kind of experimental condition is that testosterone increases when exposed to a competitive rival when a partner is ovulating. So they would bring in pairs, you have your girlfriend or your wife or whatever. When she is ovulating, you go into the lab and then they're showing you, kind of pictures, competitive rival. And then it's like, oh, does the testosterone higher in these men than when they're exposed to that picture when their partner is not ovulating? So these are kind of like interaction effects with ovulation that kind of depend on the man essentially being able to detect ovulation. They mention a few of these in the chapter. What I've put here are some more recent papers that kind of call a lot of this into question. I think a lot of this is research that actually doesn't seem to replicate that well. The idea that men can kind of detect ovulation, it seems pretty mixed. So yeah, some pretty good studies, some much more recent ones, because in this chapter, a lot of the studies they look at are, about 10 or 15 years old. They don't mention any of these newer ones, maybe because they're trying to kind of describe like, here are some actual positive effects that we found, and maybe not just mention like we're finding null results across these. But, it's something to keep in mind, something to keep to question, because this is research I'm a little bit more familiar with, that like, it's not necessarily, a home run, a lot of this research, like, oh yeah, this is definitely happening and we know this and that. A lot of these studies are just kind of one-offs. But anyway, going on now to the next slide. Hormones and female mating behaviors. We talked about men, talk about women now, okay? As mentioned in the video I did recently on the dual sexuality framework, right? By Gangstad and Din Hasselton. This kind of talks about, the evolved dual sexuality that might exist across the menstrual cycle for women, right? There's a conceptive phase and a non-conceptive phase, right? There's a period when women can have sex, they can conceive, become pregnant, and there's a period when women can't. But unlike many animals, human beings have evolved to have sex across the whole menstrual cycle. So there could be different, psychological adaptations associated with having sex when you're not able to conceive and having sex when you are able to conceive, right? So we might expect some changes in behavior there, or, different sorts of things. Classic study, I think this was by Miller and colleagues. Ovulation at the strip club, right? So they went to a strip club, they looked at strippers, they measured their ovulation status, and they calculated how many tips they got. Who got more tips? Well, women got more tips when they were ovulating. So that's kind of a fun classic study in a naturalistic environment there. Women got more tips when they were ovulating. So as I mentioned in the past slide, it doesn't necessarily seem clear that men can actually detect these things, but then there are other studies that kind of indicate, well, something's going on if women are getting more tips when they're ovulating. So that doesn't necessarily mean men can detect the ovulatory status of women, but it could mean that women also shift their behavior when they're ovulating. They behave in a different way, right? So there's different mechanisms that can produce this result. It's not clear which of those is going on, but there's also some research that men are able to detect scents. For example, t-shirts that had been worn, vaginal scents that had been collected in the lab when ovulating as well. So, a woman will wear a shirt. When she's ovulating, it will go into the lab. Men will smell it and say, oh, I like this one more than the other. So there's some on that. I'm not sure how well all of that has replicated. There is some evidence that women change their vocal pitch when they're ovulating, right? So that's not necessarily a direct detection of ovulation from men, but it would be a behavior that women engage in that could signal fertility status, right? Change in walk, similar kind of thing, right? Change in clothing choice. And I think this actually has been more replicable from what I have seen, that when women are ovulating, they actually pick kind of preferences for clothing in that sense, different preferences for clothing, perhaps more revealing clothing. Okay, so men probably receive women as more attractive when ovulating. That's kind of what this chapter says, what they say about the research, what the authors of the chapter said. They said, altogether, this is probably pretty good evidence that men do perceive women as more attractive when they're ovulating. And like I said, it doesn't seem entirely clear to me the mechanism behind it. It could be different effects from different things, right? So we talk about human beings as having concealed estrus, but maybe it's not entirely concealed if we're kind of able to pick up on it in a bunch of subtle ways, right? So perhaps there's an effective scent, right, which would be kind of a direct detection, right? Perhaps there's a change in women's behavior that adds on top of that. And so you get these different small effects that contribute to produce, okay, women are more attractive to men on average when they're ovulating there. But as the authors say here, these effects, they tend to be small. They also kind of tend to be inconsistent. And when you look at specific hormones in women that are associated with higher perceptions of attractiveness, there the research is less clear as well. So we, look at a lot of studies, they don't actually measure female ovulation. They ask women to kind of count and guess, like, are you ovulating or not? That's been a big problem with a lot of past research on like mating behavior and hormones. And it's one of the reasons a lot of newer research actually doesn't replicate, because now they're kind of looking at specific hormones and trying to measure it. And they're saying, it's not really matching up with what we would expect for like the most fertile stage to actually be associated with the highest attractiveness. But generally what you kind of see is higher estrogen is what's associated with attractiveness in conjunction with low progesterone. Okay, so going on to the next slide. Hormones and female perceptivity, okay? So perceptivity, how proactive in that sense are women in as far as like agentic in behaving differently, seeking out mating kind of context or opportunities when, they are ovulating or fertile or something like that. So women's hormones, they modulate their own behavior, right? Women are not just like passive agents, right, just existing, and now their hormones are high, so men are going to them, and now their hormones are low, so men are not. Humans are pretty agentic. So women's hormones modulate their own mating behavior. Very consistent across the research. What we do see is that concurrent with ovulation or the periovulatory phase in women, female libido goes up. That's something I think that is very, very consistent and well replicated. Of all of the different controversies, things that don't replicate, that is one that we do see pretty consistently. Libido goes up, okay? We also see that women initiate more sex with their romantic partners, right? So it's not just like extra pair desire. We also see a lot of in-pair desire as well. More sexual assertiveness, right? Women initiating more sex, that kind of a thing. And again, this is an effect that they mention in this chapter. It's stronger for partnered women, right? So rather than ovulation necessarily producing something where women are going to be seeking sex outside of the relationship or seeking sex with strangers, could be the opposite, that it's actually to facilitate pair bonding and especially to facilitate conception with a mate that has already been selected, right? And this is something that I talk about in the video a few videos back, right? The dual sexuality framework, where they discuss, the best thing for a woman to do from the evolutionary perspective would be to acquire the same genes from essentially, the long-term mate that they've chosen. A lot of kind of the dual mate hypothesis stuff, it hasn't really replicated. A lot of evolutionary psychologists, I think most, including Gangstad, who formulated it, they said, yeah, I'm not sure that's correct. They kind of moved on from that. So ovulation in this sense, this enhanced libido, this heightened libido, probably associated with, time to get pregnant from my partner, from the person I'm with. What do we see for women that are single, on the other hand? Enhanced libido, but also enhanced loneliness. So it could be in that case that if it's enhanced loneliness, it's not just a desire to go out and have sex with strangers or whatever the case may be, but also a desire to enter relationships. So in that sense, it can be motivating to seek and find and form long-term relationships. As I mentioned, the desire seems to be highest when estrogen is high, progesterone is low, okay? Another mechanism for this could be that we tend to see women, when they're ovulating, they have higher self-perceived mate value, right? So they tend to view themselves as more attractive. They tend to feel more attractive. And something we know is that people behave in a way that's often congruent with how they feel about themselves. So if women are behaving like they have higher mate value in naturalistic context, that kind of a thing, that can also explain why they're perceived as more attractive. Maybe they're putting on a little bit more makeup. Maybe they're trying a little bit harder. Maybe they're going out and being a little bit more confident or flirty or whatever the case may be. And we see that again. There's higher flirting behavior. This also kind of reflects patterns that we observe in primates, right? That when female primates are going through their estrus, which is not concealed, right? Female perceptivity is higher, and again, it's higher toward the socially dominant males. So when women become more interested in sex, when female primates go through estrus and they become a little bit more interested, then they're going to give more attention to kind of the dominant male primates in that case. So let's go on to the next slide. Hormones and female receptivity. What do we know about how women respond based on these sex hormones and fluctuations within the body and that sort of a thing? So Receptivity to sexual stimuli can be upregulated during ovulation, right? So just as there's an increase in libido, right, we might also expect to see an increase in the responsiveness to sexual stimuli. So a woman is not ovulating, for example. She's viewing an erotic picture. Maybe the arousal is here. She is ovulating. She views the erotic picture. Now the arousal is way up here, okay? So that's what that means, kind of that receptiveness there. There's a higher neural response. They looked here, I think it's some EKG studies, I think it was, associated with higher estrogen when viewing erotic images. So we tend to see that upregulation even on the neural level. We see conversely, and perhaps I think this will surprise some people, associated with ovulation in women is lower risk-taking behavior. Why might that be? Well, there's higher conception risk, right? And if we think about how behaviors evolved concurrent with the possibility to get pregnant or not, hormones regulating that and that sort of thing in an ancestral environment, right? Women had to be very careful about potentially conceiving, right? Our human ancestors, our female ancestors, had to be very careful about potentially conceiving. It was always kind of a risk, and part of that risk would have been, coercive situations, non-consensual situations as well, always present to some extent, more or less, throughout human history. So what we actually see when women are ovulating, they engage in lower risk-taking behavior. You see heightened libido, and then you might expect okay, that means women are going to get really horny and they're going to go out and look for sexual partners. Seems to be the opposite, actually. Seems to be the opposite case, okay? So that would be an adaptation, probably to avoid forced copulation or pregnancy, or, even kind of a counter-adaptation to avoid making bad decisions when potentially conceptive. Related to that, there's some research looking at life history strategy, fast or slow life history strategy. When women are ovulating, and this is upregulated, a fast life history strategy, which is basically, associated with a more harsh developmental environment, associated with higher sociosexuality, although some recent research is calling into question maybe life history strategy is not actually associated with sociosexuality. Again, Gangstad and authors on a very recent paper from this year go over that, but I'll make a new video on that. Well, because now I'm digressing a little bit. But life history strategy, slow. What is it? Like I said, bad decision making. That's kind of the way I think of it in my mind. But it's higher risk taking, less investment in offspring, desire to have more offspring with less parental care. If you look at behavioral manifestations of this, it can be, typically associated with lower socioeconomic status, lower levels of education, et cetera, et cetera. Slow life history strategy, on the other hand, kind of the opposite, right? Higher investment in somatic or individual efforts. So then you have, higher socioeconomic status, higher levels of education, fewer offspring, but higher investment in offspring, which in human beings means, less likely to cheat, less likely to get divorced, that kind of a thing. So fast life history strategy, when women are ovulating and they tend to score higher on this, mini K scale that measures kind of life history strategy, then they are more likely to seek out opportunities to conceive, right? Sex, that sort of a thing. When women have a slow life history strategy, on the other hand, they tend to be more cautious, okay? They tend to think, okay, now I'm ovulating, I gotta be extra careful, about choosing a partner, about going out and having sex, that kind of a thing. So they're more likely to avoid conception, right? Because, what's really the defining characteristic here? The difference, some level of caution, right? Some level of, avoiding risk and making good decisions. So aside from life history strategy, risk-taking more broadly associated with ovulation, okay? It could be an adaptation to avoid kind of forced copulation or pregnancy, that kind of a thing. We see women say they're less likely to visit a bar, they're less likely to go out, less likely to say that they're gonna walk in like a dimly lit area, so they're avoiding things. When there's other men in experimental conditions and they're asked how do you perceive this man, they're more likely to perceive these strange men as being sexually coercive and more likely to perceive men in general that way, right? And similarly in these experimental conditions, you have a woman sitting someplace like that, or, you bring a woman into a lab and there's a guy sitting in a chair, something like that. When she's ovulating, she will sit further away from that man than when she isn't, right? So rather than seeking out sexual contact, it seems actually that there's some wariness there. There's some desire, unconscious probably, to avoid situations with men that are potentially dangerous in that sense. So as I mentioned, potential links with life history strategy, and, it only got a very brief mention in this book, probably not more than a few lines. Probably it needs to be a whole chapter on its own. Contraceptives, they turn all of this, on its head. All of these studies have to be done in women and men, well, I should say women, because there's not many contraceptives for men, in women who are naturally cycling, right? You get women on hormonal contraceptives and that sort of thing. All of that goes out the window. We're not entirely sure what the effects of that are. Again, very mixed results and all of that, but you can't expect the same kinds of patterns with women who are on contraceptives as you can with women who are normally cycling. So let's go on now to the next slide. Women and testosterone. We tend to think of testosterone as a male hormone, but testosterone also has a lot of roles for female sexuality, right? Particularly it upregulates, I should say, libido in women. Certainly much lower levels of testosterone in women, but they matter, okay? So some research here. One of these said when women watch The Notebook, the movie, their testosterone went up a little bit. When women view photos of men's faces, their testosterone goes up a little bit. When women imagine sex with an attractive partner, it goes up a little bit, okay? Increased testosterone in a speed dating event, I've described those in the past, right? But not a casual meet and greet. So when women are put into a situation where they can meet potential partners, their testosterone goes up a little bit. But if it's a similar kind of scenario, but it's just to meet like female friends, it doesn't go up the same, okay? Interesting there. So testosterone increases in women. They go up following romantic context, and they also spike a little bit following sex, okay? Testosterone in women, as far as like a baseline, it increases in earlier stages of relationship formation as well. And however, later in relationships, it goes down if the relationship is more satisfying. So we actually see a pattern that kind of mirrors what we see with men, right? That single men have higher testosterone. When they get in a relationship, it's a little bit lower, okay? Women, when they first enter a relationship, their testosterone goes up a little bit. That's probably related to sexual behavior. Then if the relationship is satisfying, their testosterone goes down a little bit more. So why could that be? Probably due to interactions with cortisol, although they don't mention that in this. So we know as well that testosterone in women is linked to psychological experiences with orgasm, essentially how they feel that, and the same with estrogen as well, right? It's linked to how they feel it physically as well as to their psychological perceptions of their own orgasm. So next slide here, cortisol and partnership formation. A little bit on this. Cortisol was not one of the hormones that was kind of a prime candidate decades and decades ago. They're looking at it more now because there can be a lot of interactions, testosterone, cortisol interactions, and also that cortisol itself can have a role in kind of long-term partnership formation. Some of you will remember a classic study where they would have people walk across a bridge, and then there would be a confederate, right, a research assistant at the other end of the bridge, and they would say, rate how attractive they are. And they would give higher ratings to this person after they walked across the scary bridge, right? They're more attractive. This was called misattribution of arousal. And it's kind of like, okay, you walked across the scary bridge, so you're scared. Your heart is beating fast. Your cortisol is probably high. Now you're viewing this stranger as more attractive than you would rate them if you had just walked across, the parking lot to see them. So misattribution of arousal, cortisol, possibly, and they didn't measure that in the original study, but possibly a mechanism for that, right? We know in couples that have recently formed and recently fallen in love, so couples that are still in kind of that love honeymoon stage, they have higher cortisol, right, concurrently with each other. We know that male cortisol, it also kind of goes up when men interact with women, but not necessarily with men in similar kind of contexts, okay? Speed dating, cortisol increases as an anticipatory effect before these speed dating things. And remember, I mentioned like a meet and greet, which is kind of like a control for speed dating, right? You want to know what effect speed dating is going to have on hormones. So you have your speed dating event, and then you have another, it's just like a meet and greet with like same-sex people, okay? So before engaging in either of these, cortisol spikes, but after the event, after the speed dating event, it's still really high. After the meet and greet, it's down low. So it seems to be kind of this prolonged exposure to mating context kind of keeps cortisol very, very high. One mechanism for this has been called the pair bond initiation and maintenance model, which is kind of like pair bonding. The evolution of pair bonding, right, came a little bit later in human evolutionary history, right? We're kind of pair bonding species now, remarkably so among mammals. We're 3 to 9% of mammals that do this. Most don't, but human beings remain in these really long pair bonds, quite committed, typically. So how did that evolve? Well, if it evolved from something, it typically evolved on other mechanisms, in human psychology that might have preceded that. So pair bonding may have co-opted the stress response system, which means as far as the hormonal mechanisms are concerned, pair bonding relies on cortisol, that was kind of a product of the stress system in that sense. So we know that cortisol can moderate like affiliation with each other, right? When two people are kind of stressed and nervous and in love, they want to come together to kind of lower stress and anxiety, right? So it can facilitate pair bond formation. That way it can also help in navigating conflicts. When people have a conflict, cortisol spikes, you want to kind of lower it, so you want to come to resolutions for conflict, that kind of a thing. Cortisol can facilitate the way that emotions are perceived in other people, so interactions kind of with theory of mind ability and that sort of a thing. So it's important to understand. Cortisol is a hormone. We don't know a ton about it, but it could have roles for, the formation of long-term relationships, pair bond formation, and all of that. Probably not independently from all of these. Something this chapter did not talk a lot about is all of the interaction effects between female sex hormones, male sex hormones, and cortisol. But it's quite expansive, and the literature is really all over the place. You get results in one direction and another. So anyway, on that note, let's go on to the next slide. Last slide, not a part of the chapter, but kind of my final thoughts on this. Reading through this chapter, going through the citations, looking at the dates on them, a lot of these papers, when you say like, oh, when women watch The Notebook, testosterone goes up, or something like that. A lot of these are experiments that have only been done once. So they're kind of one-offs. They've never been replicated. We don't know if the effects are real. A lot of these papers are kind of old. They covered some new research as well, but perhaps not as much as I would have liked for kind of a newer chapter, all right? What we know now with research on hormones in psychology, that kind of thing, over the last 5 years or so, a lot of this research on hormones and mating behavior, and not just mating behavior, but things like sex hormones in memory, in neuroscience, for example. A lot of this doesn't replicate, okay? A lot of it doesn't just not replicate, but it produces effects in the opposite direction. So it's like, okay, high testosterone is associated with enhanced memory in this task. High testosterone is associated with a worse memory in this task. And now here's a null result. It doesn't do anything. So a lot of these hormonal effects, they don't replicate, and the results are kind of all over the place, all right? Some of this is because early methods for estimating hormones just ask people to count. Like imagine, particularly in the case of women and cyclic hormones, right? Kind of like imagine when you were ovulating last. Count down from your last period, that kind of a thing. So those probably aren't very precise, and actual measurements of hormones also, being used consistently in this research, also kind of new, but, they're getting a lot better with the methodology here. I say this, but it doesn't mean this kind of research is like a wash. Actually, that makes this a really cool and promising area of research, because there's a lot here that there probably is something going on. That's not my position that like there's no effects of these. But as far as the research is concerned, with a lot of this stuff, we really don't know what it is yet. So if you're interested in researching hormones and that kind of a thing, or you're interested in kind of like new discoveries or whatever, this is actually a really cool topic. But as far as like really conclusive things that we can say, there isn't a lot. So if anyone's trying to tell you like hormones definitely do this or they definitely do that, be a little bit wary, because a lot of it doesn't replicate. Some conclusive things that I think we do know that are very, very consistent, okay? Ovulation, right? Estrogen in women, low progesterone, high testosterone in men, and also higher testosterone in women. These upregulate libido, okay? They make people hornier. Boom. Very consistent. That replicates, okay? And there's also potentially many real effects that we see across the research, but they're very, very small, okay? So I think, for example, the clothing shifts, choices in clothing, was actually one that actually kind of has replicated pretty well, but these are small effects. We don't know how practically meaningful they are. So we can see effects in the research, and I've always cautioned in a lot of my videos, pay attention to effect sizes. Try and figure out if these effects are meaningful, because we might see effects that are real, but they're very, very small. And so they're part of a larger picture in human mating behavior, right? You can't just chalk everything up about decision-making, mating behavior, and all of that to something, that has an effect size of 0.05 or whatever, right? It's not going to work. But it can still be a part of the picture. So anyway, that is it. Last slide. Like the channel, subscribe, hit the bell. We have a Patreon. Join, subscribe, help support the project. Next time, I'll make another video for you very soon. Chapter 6 coming up. See you later.